January 11th, 1944, RAF Lakenheath, Suffolk, England. Dawn broke cold and grey across the frozen airfield, revealing a forest of bombers. 85 B-17 flying fortresses stood silent on the frost-hardened grass, their olive-drab skins beaded with dew, their 4 propellers frozen in mid-turn. In the briefing hut, 200 men sat wooden-faced as a staff officer traced a red line across the wall map. The line stretched from England deep into Germany, past Hanover, past Magdeburg, all the way to the black heart of the Reich, Berlin. A low murmur rippled through the room. Not fear, something colder, fatalism. Captain Joseph Twitty, a bombardier from Birmingham, Alabama, leaned to the man beside him. "That's 8 hours in the air," he whispered. 4 hours of nobody watching our backs. He was right. The journey would span 1,400 miles. For the first 600 miles, the bombers would fly with fighter escort. P-47 Thunderbolts could reach the Rhine, perhaps a little beyond. Then the fighters would turn back, their tanks dry, and the fortresses would enter what the crews called the killing zone. For 300 miles in every direction, Luftwaffe interceptors waited. Messerschmitt 109 seconds. Focke-Wulf 190 seconds. They would come in waves, climbing to 25,000 feet, their yellow noses glinting in the winter Sunday. They would attack head-on, filling the sky with 20mm cannon shells that exploded inside aluminum fuselages, tearing men apart. They would wait until the bomber stream turned for home, engines damaged, crews exhausted, and they would strike again. This was the arithmetic of death. In the first 3 months of 1944, the 8th Air Force would lose 700 bombers, 30% of each crew. The men who survived the explosions, the fire, the bailout into enemy territory, called themselves members of the Lucky Bastard Club. The membership requirements were simple: be alive, for now. The problem was fuel, not the bombers' fuel, the fighters'. The P-47 carried 230 gallons internally. With a 150-gallon drop tank, it could push 500 miles into Germany before the needle trembled on empty. The PY-38 Lightning could go farther, but its twin engines guzzled gas and its performance above 20,000 feet faltered in the thin, super-cold air. German pilots learned to wait. They watched the silver contrails of the Allied fighters curl away at the Ruhr, and then they pounced. The bombers were alone. Flying steel boxes, 8 tons of bombs, 10 men per ship, moving at 180 miles per hour through a sky that had become a shooting gallery. Staff Sergeant Walter Doherty, a waist gunner from Cleveland, kept a diary. On January 20th, he wrote, "We lost 9 ships from our group today. 9. I saw 3 go down in flames before we even reached the target. The fighters just sat back and watched us burn." The Luftwaffe called it the Jagdverband, the hunting formation. They had 3,000 fighters in the West alone. Their pilots were veterans of 2 years of war. They knew the limits of American range better than the Americans did. They would shadow the bomber stream, radioing ahead, vectoring reinforcements. By the time the B-17 seconds reached the initial point, the final turn toward the target, the sky would be black with enemy aircraft. The bomber crews called it being swarmed. The Germans called it a turkey shoot. That January, something had to change. The strategic bombing campaign, the entire plan to cripple German industry before the invasion of France, depended on getting those bombers to Berlin and back. Without fighter escort all the way, the losses would become unsustainable. The crews were already at the breaking point. On the base at Lavenham, a pilot of the 390th Bomb Group locked himself in his quarters and refused to fly. He was not court-martialed. The flight surgeon simply nodded and wrote "operational exhaustion" on the man's record. Everyone understood. They were asking men to commit suicide in slow motion. The answer, everyone agreed, lay in a new fighter. The North American P-51 Mustang. It had arrived in England the previous autumn. British test pilots had flown it and reported something extraordinary. At 15,000 feet, it was fast, nimble, and its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine sang with a smooth, inexhaustible power. But the American engineers saw a problem. The Mustang's internal fuel capacity was just 225 gallons. In clean condition, no drop tanks, it could fly 900 miles. With standard 200-gallon drop tanks, it could reach Berlin. Barely. But there was a catch. The standard tanks were designed for ferry flights, not combat. They were heavy. They created drag. And the moment a pilot released them, his range dropped back to the original 900 miles. For the return journey, the bombers would still be alone. The Mustang had the speed, it had the altitude, it had the firepower. 6 50 UA caliber machine guns, but it did not have the legs, and without legs, it was just another beautiful piece of sculpture. The bomber crews nicknamed it the Little Friend. A cruel joke. Their little friend always seemed to have somewhere else to be. 7th of February, 1944, RAF Blakeslee, Essex. The 354th Fighter Group had just converted to Mustangs, and their commander was not impressed. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakeslee walked the flight line in a sheepskin jacket, his breath fogging in the damp air, watching mechanics wrestle 200-gallon drop tanks under the wings of his aircraft. Blakeslee was 32 years old. He had flown Spitfires with the RAF before America entered the war. He had 23 kills. He carried a slide rule in his flight suit pocket and a reputation for doing math in his head while other pilots were still waking up. Men called him the Professor. Behind his back, they called him worse. Blakeslee did not drink. He did not smoke. He flew. He studied fuel consumption charts the way other men studied pin-up girls. That morning he climbed into the cockpit of his P-51B and ran the numbers again. 225 gallons internal, 200 gallons external, 425 gallons total, at normal cruise, burning 45 gallons per hour, that gave him 9.5 hours of flight time. At an average speed of 320 miles per hour, that was 3,000 miles of range. In theory. In reality, combat power settings, climb to altitude, weaving to stay with the bombers. All of it burned closer to 70 gallons per hour, and the moment he jettisoned those heavy tanks, he lost nearly half his fuel. The bomber escort mission profile required 8 hours airborne. The math did not work. Unless. Blakeslee climbed down from the cockpit and walked to the maintenance shack. He found Master Sergeant Carl Nordstrom, a quiet Swede from Minnesota who kept the group's records. "Carl," Blakeslee said, "what if we don't drop the tanks?" Nordstrom looked up from a worn ledger. "Sir, what if we keep them? Fly the whole mission with them on. Can we modify the plumbing?" The sergeant considered. The standard drop tanks were built to be disposable. Their fuel lines connected to the main system through a simple valve. Once empty, you pulled a lever, and they fell away. But if you could refill them from the main tanks, if you could keep them attached all the way to Berlin and back, you would retain that extra 200 gallons for the entire round trip. The drag penalty would be real. The Mustang would be slower, less maneuverable, but it would have the range. Nordstrom found a pencil and began sketching. "We'd need a transfer pump, sir. And some extra line. We could pull the solenoid from a spare fuel selector valve." "Might work." Blakeslee nodded. "Work up a prototype. I want to test it tomorrow." The next morning, a fog-shrouded Essex airfield became a laboratory. Mechanics fitted a P-51 with a jury-rigged transfer system. They installed two 85-gallon tanks instead of the standard 200-gallon monsters. The smaller tanks were sleeker, producing less drag. Total capacity dropped to 395 gallons, but the weight savings were significant. And the smaller tanks, Blakeslee reasoned, could be kept attached throughout the mission because they were less cumbersome in a dogfight. The key was the transfer pump. It would move fuel from the main tank into the drop tanks as they emptied, keeping them topped off and their weight constant, then draw it back when needed. Blakeslee took the modified Mustang up alone. He climbed to 20,000 feet, set cruise power, and watched the gauge. For 3 hours he flew in a giant oval over the North Sea, switching the transfer pump on and off, monitoring fuel flow. The numbers held. With the smaller tanks and the pump, he could maintain a burn rate of 50 gallons per hour. That gave him 7.9 hours of endurance. Just enough, barely enough, but enough. He landed as the winter sun set. the Mustang's tires kicking up spray from a puddle on the runway. The crew chief trotted over. "Well, sir?" Blakeslee unstrapped his helmet. "It works. Write it up. I want 20 aircraft modified by next week." Word spread. Not as praise, as rumor. The professor had gone crazy. The Mustang was a thoroughbred. You didn't saddle a thoroughbred with extra baggage and expect it to run. In the officers' mess, pilots from the 4th Fighter Group, still flying Thunderbolts, laughed into their beer. "Blakeslee's going to fly to Berlin with training wheels on," one said. The Luftwaffe would eat him alive. But Blakeslee had done the math. He had factored the drag. He had calculated the weight penalty against the survival rate of bombers. The equation was brutal. A Mustang with drop tanks flew 20 miles per hour slower than a clean Mustang. It turned wider. It climbed slower. But a bomber without escort had a 30% chance of death. A bomber with escort had a 5% chance. The trade-off was obvious. If you were a bomber crewman, if you were a fighter pilot, it felt like surrendering your edge. February 23, 1944. The 354th flew its first long-range escort mission with the modified Mustangs. The target was Steyr, Austria, a journey of 1,200 miles. As the Mustangs taxied to the runway, their drop tanks glinting dull aluminum against the camouflage paint, a group of P-47 pilots stood by the control tower, shaking their heads. One shouted through cupped hands, "Don't forget to drop those bathtubs before the Huns see you." Blakeslee led the group. His call sign was Falcon. He clicked his radio twice, the signal to form up, and the Mustangs climbed into a sky of flawless blue. They rendezvoused with a stream of B-24 Liberators over the channel, then turned southeast. The bomber crews, scanning the sky for their little friends, saw something odd. The Mustangs still carried their drop tanks. Over the intercom, a tail gunner asked his pilot, "Sir, why haven't those fighters dropped their tanks? They're going to be too slow." The pilot, Captain Jack Rawlings, had heard about Blakeslee's experiment. "They're trying something new," he said. "Let's hope it works." At the Ruhr, the P-47 seconds turned back. Their tanks were dry. The bomber stream continued alone. But not alone. The Mustangs stayed, weaving above the formation, their drop tanks still attached. A flight of Focke-Wulf 190 seconds appeared at 1 o'clock high, circling like sharks. They saw the tanks. They saw the slower speed. They attacked. The first pass was head-on. A 190 lined up on Blakeslee's Mustang. Blakeslee fired a deflection shot at 400 yards, his tracers arcing into the German's engine. The 190 rolled inverted and dove away, streaming oil. A second attacker came from below. Blakeslee's wingman, Lieutenant Sammy Pierce, dropped his nose and fired. The German pilot jinked, but the Mustang's 6 guns walked a line of holes across his wing route. He broke off. The rest of the Luftwaffe flight, seeing the disciplined gunnery, hesitated. They were not used to facing fighters this far east. They expected easy prey. Instead, they found professionals who had enough fuel to fight. The bombers reached Steyr, dropped their loads, and turned for home. The Mustangs stayed with them all the way back to the channel. Not one bomber was lost to enemy fighters. Flak claimed 2. That was all. In the debriefing shack, Blakeslee wrote his report in neat block letters. Modified Dropo-tank system effective. Range extended to 8 hours. Combat performance degraded approximately 12%. Bomber protection 100%. Recommend immediate adoption by all Mustang groups. The next morning, the 4th Fighter Group's commander, Colonel Donovan Smith, read the report over coffee. He set it down and stared out the window at his own flight line of Thunderbolts. He picked up the phone. "Get me General Kepner," he said. "I think we need to talk about the Mustang." But the Luftwaffe was not finished mocking. On March 3rd, over Frankfurt, a German pilot named Hauptmann Günther Rohl saw the silver tanks gleaming under the Mustang wings. He radioed his squadron. "Amis fliegen mit Badewannen." The Americans are flying with bathtubs. He led his swarm in a diving attack, confident the overloaded fighters would be easy targets. Rohl was an ace with 275 kills. He knew speed. He knew maneuver. He closed to 300 yards behind a Mustang flown by Lieutenant Charlie Hobb. He fired. His cannons hammered the tail. The Mustang shuddered. But Hobb did not run. He did not jettison his tanks. He rolled into a tight left turn, using the Mustang's superior high-altitude performance to claw for energy. The drop tanks, still full, made him heavy, but they also gave him options. He could afford to burn extra fuel in a prolonged maneuver. He could afford to fight. Rawl overshot. Hobb reversed, his guns tracking the German fighter as it flashed past. He fired a 102nd burst. The 190's cockpit shattered. Rawl bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the dark earth below. The rest of the swarm broke off. The bathtubs, it seemed, had teeth. Word travelled through the Luftwaffe ranks. The Americans had solved the fuel problem. The fighters were staying. The killing zone was shrinking. But shrinking was not enough. Berlin still lay beyond their reach. The Mustang with 85-gallon tanks could get to the German capital, but only just. It could fight, but not for long. The margin was too thin. Blakeslee knew it. The bomber crews knew it. The generals in Washington knew it. The question was not whether the Mustang could reach Berlin. The question was whether it could fight when it got there. March 15th, 1944, 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, studied a chart on the wall. The chart showed bomber losses by month. January, 695 heavy bombers. February, 530. March, so far, 412. The trend was downward, but the numbers were still catastrophic. At this rate, the bomber force would be combat ineffective by summer. The invasion of France, Operation Overlord, was scheduled for June. They had to achieve air superiority over Germany before the first landing craft touched the beaches. That meant Berlin. It meant the Messerschmitt factories at Regensburg. It meant the ball-jarring plants at Schweinfurt. It meant flying into the heart of the Reich and making the Luftwaffe rise to fight. But the Luftwaffe would not rise if the bombers could not reach the targets. And the bombers could not reach the targets without fighter escort all the way. Spaatz turned to his operations officer, Brigadier General Frederick Anderson. "How many Mustangs can we modify by April 1st? Anderson consulted a clipboard. "We can have 5 groups, sir, about 600 aircraft, but the tank issue remains. We need more range." Spaatz walked to the window. Outside, a squadron of Mustangs was taking off, their drop tanks glinting. What did Blakeslee's tests show? 7.9 hours endurance with the 85-gallon tanks and transfer pump. That puts Berlin at the extreme edge of operational range. If there's any headwind, if there's prolonged combat, we'll lose fighters to fuel exhaustion over enemy territory. Spaatz was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "What's the maximum internal capacity of the P-51?" Anderson opened a technical manual. Pointing to a diagram, he replied, 225 gallons, sir, but there's a sealed space behind the pilot's seat. The RAF used it for a 30-gallon tank in some models. We could do the same. Spaatz did the math in his head. 225 plus 30, 255 internal, plus 2 85-gallon drop tanks, 425 gallons total. At a conservative 55 gallons per hour, that was 7.7 hours. Still tight. But there was another variable. The bombers would be flying at 200 miles per hour. The fighters could throttle back to conserve fuel. They could cruise at 250 miles per hour, weaving slowly above the bomber stream, their engines at 60% power. That dropped consumption to 48 gallons per hour. 425 divided by 48, 8.8 hours. More than enough. He turned back to Anderson. "I want every Mustang in the 8th fitted with the rear fuselage tank. I want the Blakeslee transfer system installed on every aircraft, and I want a test flight to Berlin by the end of the month." The order went out. In maintenance hangars from Duxford to Debden, mechanics cut into pristine Mustang fuselages. They installed the 30-gallon tank behind the cockpit. They ran fuel lines through the radio compartment. They calibrated the transfer pumps. Pilots watched with mixed emotions. The rear tank shifted the center of gravity aft. It made the Mustang twitchy in pitch. On takeoff, you had to hold forward stick pressure, or the tail would rise too soon. In a dogfight, the extra weight aft made the aircraft want to snap roll. It was a trade-off, always a trade-off. But the bomber crews, when they heard the news, simply nodded. More fuel meant more protection. More protection meant a chance to survive their 25 missions and go home. On March 28th, Blakeslee himself flew the first test. He took off from Boxted at dawn, climbed to 22,000 feet, and set a course for Berlin. He flew alone, a single Mustang probing the defenses of the Reich. Over the North Sea, he engaged the transfer pump, moving fuel from the rear fuselage tank forward to keep the 85-gallon drop tanks topped off. Over Holland, he saw the first contrails of German fighters climbing to intercept, but he was still 200 miles from the capital. They held off, uncertain. A lone Mustang was either bait or insane. Blakeslee pressed on. At Hanover, he passed the point where the P-47 seconds used to turn back. He felt a strange exhilaration. He was flying over enemy territory, with enough gas to get home. It was a new sensation. At 100 miles from Berlin, he began his climb to 30,000 feet. The Mustang, heavy with fuel, clawed upward. The Merlin engine, supercharged and relentless, never faltered. Over the city, he saw the flak batteries firing, black puffs flowering around him. He did not linger. He made a single pass, waggled his wings for the photographers in a passing reconnaissance Spitfire, and turned west. The return leg took 3 hours. He landed at Boxted with 23 gallons remaining. 8 hours and 40 minutes, total flight time. The equation worked. The next day, Spaatz authorized a fuller-scale mission, April 1st. Target: the Focke-Wulf factory at Sorau, 100 miles southeast of Berlin, 150 Buzaventine seconds, 60 P-50, 1 seconds, all with the new tanks, all with the transfer system. The bomber crews were told only that their escort would stay with them all the way. They did not believe it. In the briefing room, a navigator from the 95th Bomb Group raised his hand. "Sir, what happens if the fighters have to turn back? What's our alternate target?" The briefing officer, a major with a scar across his forehead from a flak burst, looked him in the eye. "They won't turn back." "How do you know?" "Because Captain Blakeslee says so." April 1st dawned clear and cold. The bombers formed up over the channel. The Mustangs, their drop tanks glinting, formed above them. As they crossed the Dutch coast, a flight of Messerschmitts appeared, high and to the right. The German pilots saw the tanks. They radioed ahead. "Mustangs mit Zusatztanks, vollständig Begleitung." Mustangs with drop tanks, full escort. The message reached Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin. The response was immediate. Scramble every fighter in range. The Americans had committed their most valuable asset. If they could be shot down over Germany, if their fuel-laden airframes could be set ablaze, the bomber stream would be naked. The battle unfolded in layers. At 25,000 feet, the Mustangs engaged the first wave of Germans. The Luftwaffe, expecting slower opposition, found themselves outturned in the thin air. The P-51, even with its extra weight, held an edge above 20,000 feet. Its laminariflow wing kept its speed. Its Merlin engine breathed better than the German Daimler-Benz or BMW power plants. The drop tanks, still full, gave the Mustang pilots permission to burn fuel in high-power combat settings. They could chase a German down to 15,000 feet, then climb back to 30,000 to rejoin the bombers. They had the energy budget to spend. Below, the Bo-17 seconds droned on. Their gunners watched the dogfight above, the contrails weaving like white ribbons against the blue. They saw a Messerschmitt explode, its wing shearing off. They saw a Mustang, perforated by cannon fire, streaming smoke but staying in formation. They saw something they had never seen before. Their escorts never left. Not at the Ruhr. Not at Hanover. Not at Magdeburg. At the initial point, the bombers turned toward Sorau. The Mustangs turned with them. At the bomb line, the fortresses opened their bays. The Mustangs flew protective circles above, their guns tracking the sky. No German fighter broke through. Not one. The bombers released their bombs and turned west. The Mustangs stayed. Over the return route, the Luftwaffe attacked again, this time in greater numbers. They came from the sun, from the clouds, from the flak-shattered sky. The fight lasted 90 minutes. The Mustangs burned fuel at combat settings. Their drop tanks, now half empty, stayed attached. Blakeslee, leading the group, saw his fuel gauge drop below 50 gallons. He listened to the engine, waiting for the first cough of fuel starvation. It never came. The transfer pump kept the main tank full, pulling from the rear fuselage reserve. He landed at Boxted with 12 gallons left. The engines of 60 Mustangs sputtered and died on the runway, one after another, their tanks dry. Every bomber had returned. Every single one. In April, the numbers began to shift. The 8th Air Force flew 21 deep-weapon penetration missions into Germany. They lost 120 bombers. In January, they had lost 695. The loss rate had fallen from 30% to less than 5%. The Luftwaffe, in those same 4 weeks, lost 467 sighters. Their pilots, flying against opponents who could now stay and fight, found themselves at a disadvantage. The psychological impact was profound. German aces who had survived 2 years of war were shot down by Mustang pilots who had arrived in England 6 months earlier. The veterans called it the American fuel miracle. The new pilots called it Blakeslee's math. 28th of April, 1944. The morning briefing at Lakenheath was tense. The target was Berlin. The mission was designated Operation Jackpot, 250 B-17 seconds, 102 P-51 seconds. The Mustang pilots were warned, "You will be over the capital for 30 minutes. That's 30 minutes of continuous combat. Conserve fuel, use your transfer pumps, keep your heads." Blakeslee stood in the back of the room, his arms crossed, listening. He had been promoted to colonel the week before. He had shot down his 15th German aircraft. He had not lost a single bomber under his escort in 3 weeks. He said nothing. He did not need to. The numbers spoke. The formation launched at dawn. The bomber stream assembled over the North Sea, a vast V of aircraft stretching 20 miles long. Above them, the Mustangs formed a protective canopy. The Germans watched on radar. They saw the size of the force. They saw the drop tanks, still attached, still glinting. They knew what it meant. The Americans could reach Berlin. They could fight. They could stay. The Luftwaffe committed everything. 700 fighters rose from fields across Germany. From Jever, from Wunstorf, from Brandenburg, the battle began 200 miles from the target. The first wave of Messerschmitts dove out of the sun at 26,000 feet. The Mustangs met them head-on. The sky became a maze of contrails and gunfire. A P-51 flown by Lieutenant Tony Glover took a 20mm shell in the right wing. The tank ruptured. Fuel streamed out, freezing into a white cloud of ice crystals. Glover retarded his throttle, nursing the engine. He stayed in formation. He still had his rear fuselage tank. He still had his left drop tank. He was not out of the fight. Below, the bombers entered the flak belt. The black puffs burst around them, shaking the aircraft, peppering the wings with shrapnel. A BI-17 named Made in the Shade took a direct hit in the No. 3 engine. The propeller windmilled to a stop. The pilot, First Lieutenant Tom Beck, feathered the prop and held formation. He had 25 missions. This was number 24. He needed to survive this one and the next. He saw Mustangs above, weaving, firing, protecting. He had never felt so watched over. The bomber stream reached the initial point and turned toward the target. The Mustangs, despite 90 minutes of combat, still had fuel. The transfer pumps had moved gas from the rear tank forward as the drop tanks emptied. The system was working flawlessly. Blakeslee, his own tanks nearly dry, led a flight of 8 Mustangs in a strafing run against a flak battery on the outskirts of Berlin. They dove to 5,000 feet, their guns flashing, their engines screaming at combat power. The flak tower erupted in flames. The Mustangs pulled up, trading speed for altitude, and rejoined the bombers as they released their bombs over the Friedrichshafen industrial district. On the ground, German civilians watched the armada pass overhead. They had been promised the Luftwaffe would protect them. They saw the contrails. They saw the explosions. They saw the American fighters, tiny silver crosses against the sun, still present, still fighting. An old woman, interviewed after the war, remembered that day. We knew then that something had changed. The sky was no longer ours. The return journey was a running battle. The Luftwaffe, desperate, attacked in massed formations of 40 and 50 aircraft. They came from above, from behind, from the sides. They attacked the stragglers, the damaged fortresses that could not keep up. But the Mustangs had fuel to burn. They could chase the Germans down, break up their attacks, then climb back to altitude. They could afford aggressive maneuvers that would have left them dry a month before. The rear fuselage tank, that 30-gallon reservoir hidden behind the pilot's armor plate, had become their secret weapon. As the bomber stream crossed the German border into Holland, the attacks finally ceased. The Luftwaffe had shot its bolt. 43 German fighters had been destroyed. 37 more were damaged, many forced to crash land short of their fields. The Americans had lost 6 bombers to flak, none to fighters. 6 Mustangs had been shot down, their pilots either killed or captured. But 102 fighters had launched, 96 had returned. The survival rate was 94%. In January, it had been 67. Blakeslee landed at Boxted as the sun set, his engine coughing on fumes. He had flown 8 hours and 53 minutes. He had fired 1,100 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. He had not jettisoned his drop tanks. As he climbed down from the cockpit, his crew chief took his helmet. "Welcome home, Colonel." Blakeslee looked at the sky, now darkening to purple in the west. "Home," he said, "is where the bombers land safely." May 8, 1944. The 8th Air Force had been bombing Germany relentlessly for 4 weeks. The loss rate had stabilized at 3.5%. The Luftwaffe's loss rate had climbed to 45% per mission. German fighter production was increasing, but pilot training could not keep pace. Experienced aces were being replaced by teenagers with 50 hours of flight time. The Americans, meanwhile, were rotating crews home after 25 missions. The new pilots arriving at Lakenheath and Boxted were trained in instruments, in navigation, in fuel management. They were briefed on the Blakeslee system. They were shown how to use the transfer pump, how to monitor fuel flow, how to pace their combat. The bomber crews had a new nickname for the Mustangs. They called them the Berlin Express. The name caught on. It was painted on nose art, scrawled on briefing room chalkboards, whispered in quiet moments before a mission. The Berlin Express. It meant you would get there. It meant you would come back. On the ground in Germany, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, kept a diary. On May 10th, he wrote, "The air war has entered a new phase. The enemy fighters now accompany the bombers to the target and back. Our own fighters, outnumbered and outflown, are suffering unsustainable losses. If this continues, we will lose control of the skies over the Reich by midsummer." He was right. By June, the 8th Air Force had flown 42 deep penetration missions. They had lost 167 bombers. They had destroyed over 1,000 German fighters. The ratio was 6-1. The Blakeslee modification, the simple addition of a 30-gallon fuselage tank and the transfer pump system, had turned the Mustang from a short-alleged thoroughbred into a long-distance hunter. The bomber gap, the 300-mile killing zone, had vanished. In Luftwaffe mess halls, the jokes about bathtubs stopped. Instead, pilots spoke in hushed tones about the endless Americans. They told stories of Mustangs that stayed in the fight for 40 minutes, an hour, running them out of fuel while their own tanks ran dry. They spoke of bomber streams that no longer panicked when the Escort turned back. They spoke of a war that was becoming unwinnable. On June 6th, the invasion of Normandy began. Over the beaches, there were no German bombers. The Luftwaffe, stripped of its Western fighter strength to defend the Reich, could not field a single effective strike package. Allied ground forces moved inland under skies, owned completely by the Allies. The P-51, with its drop tanks and its fuel equation, had made that possible. Private First Class James Caldwell, a ball turret gunner from Tulsa, Oklahoma, flew his 25th mission on June 12, 1944. His target was the synthetic oil plant at Merseburg, deep in central Germany. His aircraft, Shoo Shoo Baby, was a Bo-17G, with 110 missions already painted on its nose. It was a lucky ship. Caldwell at 19 was not a lucky man. He had been shot down once before, over France, and had spent 3 months with the resistance before escaping across the Pyrenees. He had volunteered to fly again. He had a photograph of his fiancée, Mary, taped inside his flight jacket. He had promised her he would come home. As the bomber stream crossed into Germany, Caldwell rotated his ball turret, scanning the sky. He saw the Mustangs above, their drop tanks visible even from his position under the belly. He knew what they meant. He had flown missions in January when the fighters turned back at the Rhine. He had seen the 109 seconds come in, untouched, unopposed. He had watched his friends die. Today felt different. The Mustangs stayed. When the flak burst overhead, shaking the aircraft, he did not panic. When the radio crackled with warnings of bandits at 2 o'clock high, he did not flinch. He trusted the numbers. Over Merseburg, the bombers released their bombs. Caldwell's turret was hit by a piece of flak the size of a baseball. It shattered the plexiglass and dented the armor plate behind his head. He was sprayed with shards of glass. He bled from a dozen cuts, but he stayed in his turret, rotating it, watching for fighters. None came. The Mustangs had cleared the sky. On the return flight, he climbed out of the turret and collapsed onto the catwalk. The waist gunner, Sergeant Eddie Moran, handed him a cigarette. "We made it," Moran said. Caldwell looked at the sky through the waist window. The Mustangs were still there, weaving in lazy swy turns, their tanks still attached. "Yeah," he said. "We did." He went home 2 weeks later, his 25 missions complete. He married Mary in August. He lived to be 83. He never forgot the sight of those drop tanks, glinting in the sun, promising protection. Colonel Don Blakeslee finished the war with 15.5 kills. He flew 250 combat missions. He was never shot down. He never lost a bomber under his escort after the Berlin missions began. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, commanded fighter wings in Korea and Vietnam, retired as a brigadier general. He rarely spoke of the fuel equation. When asked, he would say simply, "Math saves lives." The slide rule he carried in his pocket on that February morning in Boxted is now in the National Museum of the United States Air Force. It is a simple wooden rule, its scales worn smooth by use. It does not look like a weapon of war. But it was. The war ended in May 1945. The strategic bombing campaign, the argument goes, shortened the conflict by months, perhaps a year. The Mustang is credited with achieving air superiority over Europe, but the Mustang alone did not do it. The Merlin engine alone did not do it. The courage of pilots and aircrew alone did not do it. It was the combination. It was the moment when a colonel with a slide rule looked at a problem and saw not a limitation, but an equation waiting to be balanced. The technical specifications are worth remembering. The P-51B Mustang, with its 225-gallon internal capacity, weighed 7,100 pounds empty. With 2 85-gallon drop tanks and a full fuel load, it weighed 9,800 pounds. That was a 38% increase in weight. It reduced the rate of climb from 3,400 feet per minute to 2,900 feet per minute. It cut the maximum speed at 20,000 feet from 440 miles per hour to 420 miles per hour. It increased stall speed by 12 miles per hour. It made the aircraft less forgiving, more demanding. Pilots had to trim carefully. They had to manage their energy. They had to trust the math. But the math gave them something priceless. It gave them time. 9 hours in the air, 1,400 miles of range. The ability to stay with the bombers from the moment they crossed the English coast to the moment they returned. The ability to fight, not just once, but multiple times. The ability to break the back of the Jaguar band. The 30-gallon fuselage tank, that small addition behind the pilot's seat, was a compromise. It was difficult to install. It made the aircraft tail-heavy until the fuel was burned. It required a redesign of the radio equipment, but it added 15% to the internal capacity. Combined with the drop tanks, it gave the Mustang a total fuel load of 425 gallons. At cruise, that was 8.8 hours. At combat power, it was 6.2. It was enough. The transfer pump was the key. It was a simple device, a centrifugal pump borrowed from the BW-24 bomber's fuel system. It moved fuel at 30 gallons per minute. In combat, a pilot could switch it on to keep his main tank full while drawing from the drop tanks. In cruise, he could use it to balance fuel between the rear fuselage tank and the main tank, keeping the center of gravity stable. It weighed 6 pounds. It cost $14 to produce. It saved thousands of lives. The bomber loss statistics tell the story. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force had 800 operational heavy bombers. They lost 695 of them in combat. That is an 87% attrition rate. In April, they had 1,200 bombers. They lost 120. That is a 10% attrition rate. The difference was not better flak suits. It was not better bombs. It was the fuel equation. Luftwaffe records, examined after the war, show the impact on German pilot morale. In March, the average German fighter pilot flew 2 missions per day. In April, after the Berlin raids began, the average dropped to 1 mission every 3 days. The aircraft were available. The pilots were not. They were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Mustang, with its long reach, had forced the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition it could not win. The strategic consequences extended beyond the bomber war. With the Luftwaffe pinned down over Germany, the Allies achieved complete air superiority over France. DODA succeeded in part because the Germans could not move reinforcements by daylight. The P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds, free from deep escort duties, roamed the French countryside, strafing convoys, destroying bridges, killing trucks. The German army, which had ruled the Blitzkrieg, found itself immobilized by the absence of air cover. The war, which had seemed endless in the winter of 1944, began to feel winnable in the summer.